Using the right resources is important when learning anything, but it's essential when learning Mandarin pronunciation. Here are 24 great resources, most of them completely free. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about resources to learn and improve Mandarin pronunciation. As long-time listeners and learners will know, I have a particular interest in learning and teaching pronunciation, and so I want to share some of the best resources I know of in this episode. Before we get to that though, I'd like to announce that I will open my course, Hacking Chinese Pronunciation, Speaking with Confidence, next Monday. So if you want more carefully structured guidance in the form of a video course, you should stay tuned for that. Or you can just head over to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com to learn more about the course. That resource took many hundreds of hours to create, and so it's not free, but almost all of the other resources I will talk about in this episode are free. To make the discussion a little bit more structured, I have created 4 different categories of resources. So the first one is Mandarin sound references. And so this would be target audio, things you can mimic and listen to learn what spoken Mandarin sounds like. In the second category, I've put resources that explain Mandarin pronunciation, and this can be extra useful as an adult learner. In the third category, I've put advice on how to learn pronunciation, so not specific resources, but how you use these resources to improve. Then in the fourth and final category, I've put useful software and applications. As usual, there is a written article on Hacking Chinese that comes with this episode, so if you want to click around or check only one of these categories, feel free to head over to Hacking Chinese. But I will go through them in the order I just mentioned here on the podcast. So let's get started with category 1, which is basic sound references for learning Mandarin pronunciation. When you start learning to pronounce Mandarin, it's essential that you have proper audio references. You need to be able to listen to something, know how it sounds, and also have something reliable to mimic. While I will talk more about how to learn Mandarin later in category 3, I want to mention here that you should never guess how something is pronounced in Mandarin as a beginner. Don't base your reading of pinyin off English, French, or some other language that you know. Always rely on audio references, because pinyin doesn't work like you think it does unless you've studied it properly and learned all the exceptions and so on. So make sure you have proper audio references, and this is then what this category is about. I will, of course, include links to the resources that I mention here in the show notes, but again, please refer to the written article on Hacking Chinese if you're looking for something specific. The first resource I want to recommend is the Chinese Pronunciation Wiki Pinyin Chart. And this is, to my knowledge, the best pinyin chart out there, and if you're only going to use one, use this one. It has some features that makes it stand out from the competition. I mean, first it has clear audio for all the syllables with all the tones and so on, but it also has things like IPA, that's the International Phonetic Alphabet notation. It also has zhuyin, and you can have a nice full screen view and so on. And there are some other features too. But this is the best pinyin chart, so start here. However, it's useful to have more than one reference, so more than one person speaking Mandarin as your reference, because sometimes you don't know if the particular way someone says something is particular to that person, or if it's something related to how Mandarin is pronounced. And if you listen to more than one person, you get a better idea. So I've also included the Yabla pinyin chart here, which also has audio and most of the other features, but no IPA. There are many other pinyin charts, and simply searching for pinyin chart plus audio will give you more results if you are interested. I've also included a link to a YouTube video where they go through the initials and finals in Mandarin, and the reason I put this in here is that sometimes it's nice to have a video reference, and the particular thing with this video is that the camera is pointed only at the mouth, so you can clearly see if the lips are rounded, if they are spread, and so on, and this can sometimes be helpful. Another resource I want to recommend here is Chinese Pod's Introduction to Pinyin, and this is an app that's available on the web but also on Android and iOS, and it does have a full pinyin chart with audio, and there are also explanations of these sounds. However, as is often the case with many apps and explanations of Mandarin pronunciation, there are some things that are just outright wrong here. For example, they refer to a nasal U in Mandarin, which does not exist. That is not what U is, if that's what they're referring to. And the retroflex sound, so that would be R, or the finals after zh, ch, and sh, These are not pronounced with the tongue position depicted in the images that they use, but on the whole the information is mostly reliable. And I should say that this is partly why I created my pronunciation course, because I was kind of fed up with not having anywhere to point people for learning pronunciation, and they always have these quirks where people explain things that aren't right, or where it's just not very pedagogical. So if you want to see how I would do these things, please check out Hacking Chinese Pronunciation, Speaking with Confidence. Finally, I have also included Youglish here, so it's you as in you and me, and it's glish as the second part of English. And this tool was originally built to help people with English, but it also has a Chinese section. And the idea here is rather simple, but brilliant. You type a word, let's say 中文, and it then goes to YouTube and searches all the transcripts for the word that you were looking for. It then presents you with all the clips that this word appears in, at the specific time in those clips where it is said. So you can hear people say this word in context in multiple different videos and quickly browse to the next one by just clicking next. And this allows you to get a good idea of how a word is pronounced in real life by different people and in different settings. And this is a great way to get more authentic and more naturally pronounced Mandarin, as opposed to the pinyin charts, which are of course very carefully recorded. This brings us to the second category, Mandarin Pronunciation Explained. So these are resources that explain how pronunciation in Chinese works, and it's worth talking a little bit about why this might be necessary. Infants basically hear all sounds, and growing up and learning a language is about figuring out which sounds you need to maintain the ability to distinguish, because some sounds are important in some languages and then you need to distinguish them, whereas some differences are not very important and your brain will forget how to deal with these. And that means if you start learning a language very early, you do not need any theory. However, it's easy to show that simply engaging with a language and maybe living in an environment where the language is spoken is not enough to acquire a clear pronunciation as an adult. If that were the case, all the people studying Chinese in China would have awesome pronunciation, but they rarely do. And when I say awesome here, I don't mean native-like, I mean that you can speak clearly so that other people can understand you easily. And even that is not something you can just assume that you will attain by simply moving forward and keeping on learning Chinese. You need to focus on pronunciation, and one of the ways of doing that is to learn a little bit about the theory behind pronunciation. How are they produced? How are they different from each other? And how are they different from other sounds that might sound similar from other languages that you know? So the first resource I want to recommend here is the Hacking Chinese Guide to Mandarin Tones, which is my complete guide to everything you need to know about tones, and tones are of course one of the most important aspects of learning Mandarin pronunciation, and since most listeners will come from languages that don't have tones, this is also one of the biggest challenges with learning pronunciation. And in this article I share all my advice, I summarize everything into, well, a fairly long article and 3 podcast episodes, so do check that out. Next up we have Learning the Third Tone in Mandarin. The third tone causes more trouble than the other tones, and most students, I would say, mispronounce it in some way. And sometimes, for beginners, it's hard to learn how it's supposed to be pronounced, when it's supposed to change to a rising tone, and so on. But it's also the case that most people fail to realize that it is just a low tone. It is not a dipping tone, it is just a low tone in a vast majority of cases. So if this sounds new to you, go and check out that article and the accompanying podcast episode. Next, I want to recommend a beginner-friendly introduction to Mandarin Chinese phonetics by Patrik Zein, who is a fellow Swede. As mentioned in an earlier podcast episode, and I link to it in the description, I don't like using English words to approximate Mandarin pronunciation. It's fraught with problems, and maybe the most serious one is that thinking of pronunciation in terms of English words might block your ability to actually hear the sounds, because they are rarely the same as in English, and approximations are not good enough. Beyond that, though, this introduction is pretty good. Another good introduction to Chinese pronunciation is by John Pasden over at Sinosplice, so I have linked to that one as well. Next up, we have my own guide to pinyin traps and pitfalls. So this is an article and a podcast episode that aims to clear up some common problems with pinyin. And I don't mean with the pinyin system itself, I mean with the way you learn pinyin, and students often misunderstand how certain sounds are pronounced, and so I explain how these sounds are pronounced, without relying on English words then, because that's not very accurate. If you're interested, I suggest you check out episode 76 on the podcast, because of course these things are easier to talk about than it is to write about them. Finally, I would like to recommend 2 books which are technically not free, as in you can't download them for free legally, but they might be available in your library or at your school or university or something. So I will recommend them here anyway, because I know people sometimes like books and these are quite good. The first one is The Sounds of Chinese by Lin Yanhui. And this is a good introduction to Mandarin phonetics and pronunciation, and you can read this book without a background in phonetics or phonology, so it's definitely approachable as a student. The second book I want to recommend is The Phonology of Standard Chinese by Duan Musan, which is a great book, but does require some background in phonetics and phonology to make sense of. Okay, that wraps up category 2, so let's move on to category 3, which is Advice on Learning Pronunciation. Since Hacking Chinese is largely focusing on how to learn Mandarin, most of the resources here are my own, but I will also recommend at least one other. So my first recommendation here is my article Improving Your Chinese Pronunciation by Mimicking Native Speakers. And this article contains a complete video from the pronunciation course focusing on mimicking, where I go through why this is so useful, how you should mimic, along with some very practical tips and tricks for how to do this more efficiently. In summary though, mimicking is very powerful because it combines attentive listening to speaking yourself, and it also allows you to compare what somebody else says, your target model audio, with what you say, and this can allow you to get pretty far on your own for free. Next up, we have the article How to Learn Chinese Pronunciation as a Beginner. So many of the things I've mentioned so far, including mimicking, work very well at an advanced level too. It's not just a beginner tip. But what if you are a beginner and you struggle to get started? Where should you start? What should you do? This is exactly what this article addresses, so do check it out if you are a beginner. Naturally, there is an unofficial sequel to that article, which is called Improving Pronunciation Beyond the Basics. So if you're not a beginner, what do you do? How do you polish your accent? How do you find the remaining errors you might have, and how do you fix them? And all of these things are, of course, also covered in the course, but these are articles that you can read for free. And most of them also have podcast episodes. Next up, we have A Smart Method to Discover Problems with Tones. And so this is about something called minimal pair bingo using tones, where you can use a normal native speaker, and when I say normal here, I mean someone who isn't trained in phonetics and that isn't a teacher, and you can use them to figure out if your tones are good, and this is true both when you are speaking yourself and when it comes to identifying tones. So check that article out, and there's also a podcast episode where you can try this yourself. At least you can try your listening. Next, we have recording yourself to improve your speaking ability. And so if you haven't already recorded yourself a lot, I mean, if you're mimicking, you might be recording yourself, but you could just mimic without recording. But if you've never recorded yourself, you are missing out on a very useful source of insights into your pronunciation. So if you haven't done that, just do it first. Record your Mandarin and listen to it and see what you think. You will probably hear things you weren't able to identify when you listened to yourself as you were speaking, because when you're speaking, you have many other things to keep in mind. You need to think about which words to use, how to pronounce them, and so on. But when you're listening to yourself afterwards, you're only listening, and so you have a lot of capacity to actually pay attention to what you're saying and how you are saying it. And this is valuable, and it's also completely free. Finally, I would like to recommend John Paston's tips on Chinese pronunciation, and I've referenced some of his articles and other products earlier in this episode, but this page combines and collects many of them and is a good portal in general. This brings us to the fourth and final category, which is useful software and applications. I wish there was an app that was actually good for teaching Chinese pronunciation specifically, but I've checked many and I simply think that none of them are good enough to include on this list. I have received many recommendations from listeners and readers for apps and tools that purport to fix your pronunciation or identify what you're saying and say if it's right or wrong, for example by recording and comparing it to a target model. However, when checking these out, they are never very good. They are either extremely lenient, meaning you can say anything and pass, because they just care about you feeling good about your pronunciation, not actually that your pronunciation is good, or the other way around, they are too strict. You can have perfect native audio and they still get it wrong. The reason these apps don't work very well is that they rely on speech to text. So they take what you say, transcribe it into Chinese, and then compare if that transcription is identical to the intended output. And this is just not good enough. If you want to learn more about this, I did some experimentation with student audio and native speaker audio and saw how often these were transcribed correctly by various types of software. And I published that in 2 articles starting in Using Speech Recognition to Improve Mandarin Pronunciation. Still, that doesn't mean there are no useful apps for learning pronunciation, so let's have a look at what I have found. The first one is not something I've found, but something I made. It is a tone training course over at WordSwing, which focuses on your ability to identify single tones. And this is very basic, I realize that. So if you're a beginner and you can't hear the difference between, say, the second and third tone, this is a good place to start. But it only deals with single syllables and was built for a research project. And, well, it's good at what it does, but it is fairly limited. The next piece of software I want to recommend is Audacity, which is a cross-platform program for audio editing. And if you watch the video about mimicking that I recommended earlier, I use Audacity there to mimic native speaker audio. And I recommend Audacity because it's free, it's fairly powerful, it's easy to use across different platforms, and so on. Next, we have Prat, which is the go-to program for anyone working with acoustic phonetics or any kind of academic research where you need to analyze spoken language. I've spent hundreds of hours in this program in grad school, analyzing various syllables, tones, and so on. It takes a little while getting used to, and it's not the easiest program to use if you're simply after some immediate feedback, but it can be very powerful and quite interesting as well, so I want to recommend it here. This brings us to Pleco, which is the best dictionary for Chinese learners overall, but it also has good sound references for pronunciation. I mention it here rather than in the first category because the other resources I mentioned are available online or across different platforms, whereas Pleco is only available as an Android and iOS app, and if you don't have a phone, you can't really access this information. It also isn't free, so you have to purchase an add-on to get the manually recorded audio for most of the common words. And it's great here that you can get both female and male audio, which makes it very easy to quickly get an idea of how something is pronounced. And again, you should never rely on the written pinyin, especially not as a beginner. You have to listen and you have to mimic. These days, speech synthesis is rather good and is getting better all the time, but I still think that if your goal is to pronounce and to mimic, I do think that mimicking human recorded audio is better. Finally, I would also like to recommend another resource from John Paston, which is Allset Learning Pinyin, which is an app that I think is only available for iPhone and iPad, but it is free to download, has lots of audio references and some other quite useful features. Okay, so those were 24 great resources for learning or improving your Mandarin pronunciation. Naturally, even if it's essential to have good resources, the resources themselves won't improve your pronunciation. So it's all about how you use them and how much effort and time you invest into learning, and also how much you care about pronunciation. Because most people who have great pronunciation in a foreign language actually care about pronunciation. And so if you've listened this far, I think you do care, and that is indeed a very good start. If you want more carefully structured guidance to improve your pronunciation from me, including the option to get professional feedback on your pronunciation, don't forget to check out Hacking Chinese Pronunciation, Speaking with Confidence, at pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.